Spring ball is important for every college football team, but especially for the University of Utah. This one is the most important one they've had in a few years. Why is that? We're going to tell you why on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen and view of the day. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, available wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. If it's your first time listening to this show, make sure you like and subscribe. Today's episode is brought to you by TurboTax. With TurboTax, get ready for stress-free taxes and the most money back guaranteed. Head over to TurboTax.com today and get matched with your expert right now. My name is Wistrcill, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department. Excited to have on today's show a first-time guest, Shehan Jeyarajah, a national college football writer for CBS Sports, who recently wrote about Utah football as they're getting ready for spring ball. Shehan, you had Utah as one of your teams that has the most work to do, top 8 team that is the most to do during the spring. And I agree, honestly. I think they got a lot of work to do with these new pieces. Why did you put Utah on that list?
Well, there's a couple pieces to this, right? Obviously, the coordinator change on offense is the central piece of it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, going from such a pro-style system under Andy Ludwig to now sort of this RPO-style spread style that we're going to see under Jason Beck, it's just such a departure. It's one of the biggest changes that I'd argue any team is making all offseason. Now, I give Kyle Whittingham a lot of credit for making such an aggressive change, right? Like, I think that it's very easy to sit back and, maybe try to pick somebody internal or pick somebody who does what players are used to. But he decided to take a big swing. And the other piece of it too, the other reason that I think that this is such a pivotal offseason for Kyle Whittingham is that, I mean, you kind of have to imagine, right, that he wants to have immediate success, that he wants to be able to get back to conference contention. And, the last year, of course, they were picked number 1 in the Big 12. The year before, they were picked number 1 in the Pac-12. Like, they expect to be competing at a high level right away. And it's going to be a big transition.
It is a massive transition. And I'll ask you this, because like you mentioned, new offense, new offensive coordinator, new quarterback, completely new skill position players. Their most productive skill position player returning, I believe, is Landon King, their tight end. I think he caught like 3 passes. He's been a part of the team for a few years, but still, like, you get the offensive line back, which is nice, but almost everything else is new. How, you've seen other teams go through this before as well. How does it usually take in the spring? Does this leak into the season as well, them trying to sync everything up?
Well, one of the reasons for optimism, I think, is bringing over the quarterback who has experience in the system. That always does help just a little bit. I mean, kind of the original version of this, right, was Bailey Zappi transferring from Houston Baptist up to Western Kentucky. Now, look, it's going to be different. Like, we haven't seen this New Mexico offense really in a lot of ways play at this level before. Obviously, we haven't seen Devin Dampier play at the power conference level. We haven't seen Jason Beck coordinate at this level. So that's kind of makes it a little indeterminate, right? Like, I think that there will be some growing pains. There will be some adjustment to the level of competition. But the other piece of it too, though, is that you've got a lot of new guys coming in as transfers as well, who, which I think that can actually be a positive in some cases, because you're able to have a roster that fits the offense just a little bit quicker, right? So, I mean, like, you don't have like just an inside zone running back necessarily back there when you have a spread RPO system. I think that does help. So I expect some growing pains. I don't think it's going to be easy right from the start, but one of the beauties of this system too is that it's meant to make the game easier. Like, you look at Utah these past couple of years, I mean, a lot was on Cameron Rising. A lot was on the quarterback. And when a freshman gets thrust into action, it's just a lot to put on a player. So I do think that this offense is going to be easier from that perspective. But when an offense is easier, it means it's more timing based. It means it's more based on play calling. It means it's more based on the play caller and the quarterback having a lot of overlap mentally. And that's going to be a positive for them, but it's also going to be a complication for the rest of the roster.
It will be. But like you mentioned too, like, the change in turnover is good, because what was Utah last year? They were bad on offense. It was a dreadful offense to watch. I mean, losing games to Houston, where there was a stretch this team last, they didn't even score over 20. Several games a season ago. So a change was needed. They had to make one. And Shehan, it's also just been a while since quarterback play has been fun in Salt Lake City. And Devin Dampier, is fun. I know he threw 12 interceptions last year, but was the only player in the country to throw for over 2,500 yards, rush for over 1,000 yards, led the country in yards per carry. It's understandable why there are questions like, okay, is he ready to make the jump to the P4 level just because of how successful he was with legs? Even though he did very well against the P4 teams he played last year. I mean, I feel like he's ready. I think with his offensive coordinator, with Utah's offensive line, especially those two tackles, I mean, Spencer Fano, Caleb Lomu, really productive last season. Some questions at receiver for sure, but I do feel like Utah's offense is going to take a big step in the right direction next year.
No question. And I think what you know about Devin Dampier is that he's an athlete who can play at this level, right?
Yep.
Like he's somebody who can create rushing opportunities for himself. You know, when you look at that New Mexico offense last year, I believe it was the only one nationally to have 2,000-yard rushers, which
I think so.
Yeah, now the playoff might have thrown off that. I'm sure somebody's going to come and be like, "Well, Travion Henderson got there in the 16th game of the season," but at least in the regular season, I believe that they were the only pair of 1,000-yard rushers. And so, I mean, and that's something I want people to understand. This is an offense that starts with the run game, and actually, the other thing that I want people to realize about kind of these spread RPO offenses is that it's kind of a weird way to phrase this, but like they are option offenses. Like you are running an updated version of the triple option, except for instead of the options being within a phone booth, they're the length of the field. And I think that that's something that, again, makes the quarterback's job more manageable once he gets the system, which we know that Devin Dampier has. But it also gives him a lot of options and also the offensive staff a lot of options to tailor it in his image, right? So like, again, I don't expect him from day one to be this like pinpoint dynamic drop back passer. Like I think that that's going to take some time. That's probably going to be the thing that takes the longest time. But what we do know is that he can throw off of motion. We know that he's good at throwing on the run. We saw that all of last year. We know that he's going to make good decisions with the football, both in terms of pulling the ball on RPOs and also in terms of throwing to the correct players. And so that just sets a level of floor that we have not seen at Utah these past 2 years, right? I mean, obviously in 2024, we did not see that floor, but even in 2023, I would argue that we didn't really see that floor because so much of it was based on pure drop back stuff. And I think that just that aspect, playing also, by the way, in this conference that I think really does value space as an offensive concept. Like I think that it's a version of modernizing while still staying true to some of the concepts that helped get Utah here.
1,000% agree with that. And you have to adapt. You have to. And that's the fascinating question, Shehan, is Kyle Whittingham going to let Jason Beck's offense be Jason Beck's offense? Did Andy Ludwig have his struggles down the stretch? For sure. But it's also just well known too. Like they had Nate Johnson back there at quarterback a couple years ago. The Vanderbilt transfer actually came back to Utah. Just the kind of summarizing how crazy the transfer portal can be. Nate Johnson's best attribute was his running, but there was a risk he would fumble. He had a little bit of a fumbling issue. So Utah was content with, hey, we will play an incredibly ugly offensive game just so we don't turn the ball over. And you don't want to turn the ball over, but when it makes you worse, that's where the risk comes in too. So that's the question. Can Kyle Whittingham adapt and change? And that's one of the conversations, as well as all this conference realignment stuff going on in the Big 12 right now. How does it impact Utah? We're going to continue to answer the questions and break it down with Shehan in one moment. Today's show is brought to you by our friends at TurboTax. Tax season is here, and if you want help, Intuit TurboTax has your backs. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying where you're going to get your money back. Those were the days of old, right? And then you just keep waiting, wondering, worrying some more. That's how it's always worked with taxes. But now, Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. Take the stress out of taxes with TurboTax. An expert is there for you, and they will help you find every deduction possible, file every form, every investment, everything 100% accurately. That's what TurboTax prides themselves on, and they will have your back. Also, you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, this is how taxes were meant to be done. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. You can head over and get help with your taxes today by joining TurboTax now. Shehan, talking about this Utah team as they're trying to adapt. The question is Kyle Whittingham. Morgan Scalley, named head coach in waiting. It was even reported, and I've had reporters on my show talk about this, like, hey, Kyle was going to step away last year, but it just didn't end well. He didn't want to go out like that. So now Morgan has to wait longer, and it's one of those things like, hey, part of the reason it didn't go to plan last year, not just injuries, but you weren't willing to change and adapt. I do think Kyle's going to be willing to change a little bit and let a player like Devin Dampier be who he is, but I do understand the concerns about if he'll let that happen. I mean, how do you view the situation?
Well, I mean, look, the reality of the situation is, like, if you bring in a player like Devin Dampier and if you bring in an offensive coordinator like Jason Beck and you want to put them in a box, like, it's a bad plan. Like, it's just straight up a bad plan, right? If you want to have them come in and do what they do and live with some of the consequences of that, then I think it's a really good plan. And you mentioned it, like, I wasn't sure necessarily how formally it had been reported, right? But like, you would assume that Kyle Whittingham has talked about the fact that he expected to be retired at 65. Well, then 65 and he came back, right? So like, clearly I think that things have not quite gone to plan. I think, you know, and even kind of what I was alluding to at the beginning, right? Like, he wants to flip this quick and not get out of here, but like be able to sail off into the sunset with a positive memory, right? And so I do think that should give some optimism that this is that this situation's a little bit different, that they're going to be willing to be flexible and to adapt and to try different things. Again, because I think that there's a scenario, right? There's a way that this could have gone where you bring in Jason Beck and you don't give him very much leeway, where you don't give him very much flexibility to bring in players that fit him, that bring in a quarterback that fit him, where you kind of say like, hey, you know, I think that that Isaac Wilson is still a really talented player as a future, but like, there's a way to shoehorn him in that would have been, I think, really bad for everybody, right? To say like, this is our quarterback, deal with it. But they didn't do that. They were willing to build around this offense. I think that should give a lot of optimism, because the reality of the situation is, I mean, you look at Devin Dampier's numbers last year, Utah was not the only team that came calling for him. They made him a priority to add him as a starting quarterback in the transfer portal. So I do think that Utah fans should feel pretty good that Kyle Whittingham is coming in and is going to be willing to let this offense work. And again, look, if Devin Dampier throws, you know, 7 interceptions in his first 3 games, obviously that's something that's going to be addressed. But I think that they are going to really try to let this offense work and come together, because their goal ultimately is getting to that Big 12 title game at the end of the year.
And that's a goal that it feels like Utah has a chance to do if this mix of talent can come on. And it's like we talked about earlier with the spring ball, like, hey, you have a lot of work to do. It doesn't even just involve the offensive side of the ball. I mean, your top 3 D tackles are gone, one of which went to your direct rival, BYU. You lose a corner as well to Alabama. So there are pieces to add here. Most of the work will come on offense, but defense will have their work cut out for them too. Shehan, I want to move on to conference realignment stuff in a moment, but since we're on the conversation of older college football coaches, anytime you talk about Kyle Whittingham, that's what it is. You look at the rest of the old college football coaches. I think we're at an interesting point with the ones who have worked. There's been the old college football coaches who don't work, and they've gotten out. But there's a couple that have hung around for a few more years, and it's gone okay. Mike Gundy, obviously not last year. Kirk Ferentz at Iowa, even them not a normal Iowa season. Now we got Bill Belichick joining in on this as well. I do think most of these older coaches are still going to have a bounce back here. I'm not even going to touch the Gundy at Oklahoma State situation. That just seems like a mess right now. So maybe we'll see how that one goes. But like, I think Belichick will work at UNC. I do think Utah bounces back. How do you view the old dogs trying to compete with an ever-changing sport?
Well, I think that you have to, you know, look to sort of the ultimate old dog, right? Nick Saban. And the thing that he brought to college football as a coach in his 60s and into his 70s, before he retired at 72, was he was constantly willing to evolve. And that was evolution from a schematic perspective. It was evolution from a talent acquisition perspective, from a staff structure perspective. And ultimately, I think that what the difference is between coaches that will fail and succeed long-term as they get into their older age is their level of flexibility. You know, it's funny that you mentioned this group, right? Because like, when you talk about Mike Gundy, when you talk about Kirk Ferentz, like, obviously, you know, Gundy's the one coming off of a bad season, but like, they are coaches who are used to owning their fiefdom per se, right? They're used to having unlimited control. And I think that, you know, even to make some comparisons to other coaches in the Big 12, right? Like when Gary Patterson was not able to own his world anymore, it just changed things, right? And it changes things long term. I mean, even he certainly wasn't pushed out, but like Bill Snyder at Kansas State, they kind of decided like we have to move on, right? So I think that what defines these coaches are the ones that are willing to change. Now, again, we saw it from Kyle Whittingham now from a schematic perspective on the offensive side of the ball. I think that that's a huge first step. Now it's going to be, okay, how much are you willing to defer to your young coaches? How much are you willing to trust, you know, some of what you're hearing from your personnel guys to bring guys in? I think that the roster that they put together is pretty encouraging from that perspective, but some of that is unknowable until they take the field.
You're absolutely right. And speaking of things that we don't know about, it's conference realignment is something that is constantly being discussed. There's a lot of rumors about what the Big 12 will do. There's a lot of rumors about what will happen with the ACC. Are Utah and the Big 12 in a good place for the future of college football right now? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And, you know, I obviously get the question about the Big 12 a lot because this is a league that is incredibly stable and also is a league that, you know, has some ceilings on it, right? Because, I mean, I think that there are teams that will compete for national championships that will win playoff games. But like you look across the league, I mean, like Colorado won a title in 91 and like, you know, BYU has their deal and, you know, TCU had one in like the third, right? But this is not a league of teams that have necessarily won national championships, especially in the modern era, right?
Yeah.
But it's also a group of 16 teams that are incredibly passionate, I think is a huge thing that you have to talk about. That are all very invested in athletics. I expect, you know, I can't guarantee that all 16 teams will do the full rev share, but I think that the vast majority will, if not all of them, frankly. So like you have a group of teams that are all functioning at relatively peak capacity as athletic departments. And the reality is like, I think that there's always going to be a place for that. I think that there's always going to be a place for teams that are, you know, again, because if you look at the 16-team Big 12, I mean, I think that there are 11 or 12 teams maybe in that league who have the potential to win a playoff game and to make a college football playoff, right? Like not everyone will, but I think that it's there, right? Arizona State nearly did it last season alone. And they would have been a team that you would have considered a lower tier team heading in, like as a
They're picked to finish dead last in the conference last year.
Right. And you know, if you're ranking over the past 20 years, Arizona State versus the rest of the Big 12 teams, like you're talking about them as 11 or 12, not necessarily as one that's been in the 1, 2, 3. Like, again, obviously, I think Utah's capable of that. I think if Oklahoma State's able to come back, they're capable. Baylor, TCU, you know, like there's a lot of teams that I think have real upside. So, look, a lot of this has to do with television at the end of it, right? Like that's always going to be the big thing, you know, because if like right now we see the Big 12 and, you know, it's whatever, 34 million a year, whatever it is, right? If that number sticks in the 30, 40, 50, you know, that kind of range, like I think that the Big 12 should feel pretty fine about where it's at. And I think the teams in it should feel pretty fine about where it's at. If next contract you come back and, you know, the television providers are like, okay, well, we're going to drop you down to 10. Like that's when obviously you run into issues, right? But I think that the Big 12 has a very clear niche in college football, a very clear role in college football. I think the fact that it's a stable league is not something to take for granted right now. I still personally remain bearish on the idea that they're going to try to consolidate the two and break off. I don't think that's going to happen. So I think that there will be, you know, versions of it might happen, but like, I think that there will be a place for a really, really good, really entertaining, really invested league that, that performs at a high level. So I think that again, like the question that, you know, that you're always going to ask is like, is there a team in the Big 12 that will win a national championship over the next 10 years? And, you know, I would lean towards no.
You wouldn't say Utah. You wouldn't say Utah. Shame.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, look,
I wouldn't either. I wouldn't.
Yeah, you know, I mean, TCU made a national title game, right? Like Utah's made, right? Like they've had teams be in that capacity before. But like, if you had to guess over the next 10 years, I would guess probably the Big 12 will not win a national championship.
No.
The question I think is going to be from a television perspective: how much does that matter if you are consistently competing, if you are consistently there? Because even when these schools were in a Big 12 and a Pac-12 that did have teams competing for titles, like most of them were not much more than what they are right now, right? Like they were, and I think that some teams have managed to elevate themselves with the move to the Big 12 and without the specter of Oklahoma and whatever else, right? So anyway, all to say, I think it's really fascinating. I think the Big 12 is in a really good place right now, and I think that they have good leadership both at the conference level and also at the individual school level to maximize what they have. Again, and I think there's not a lot of reason to believe right now that interest from the television networks is just going to dry up when they are delivering success.
They are, and they're Brett Yormark's doing innovative things to try. Playing on Fridays, there's lots of things they're trying to do to stay consistently relevant in a college football world that continually seems to be trending more towards the top brand. So they're doing a good job, and hopefully they'll hold on. And one thing that helps the Big 12 is how unpredictable it is. This conference is incredible to watch play out. It's what we love about the sport, those of us who truly love college football. So I want to get Shehan's thoughts in one moment where he thinks Utah will currently finish among Big 12 teams in 2025. We're going to be discussing that in one moment. Today's episode of Locked On Utes is brought to you by our friends at Factor. Factor has you covered if you're trying to meet your fitness goals in 2025. Looking to optimize your nutrition this year? Factor makes eating well easy with chef-prepared, dietitian-approved meals that are fresh, never frozen, and ready to heat and eat in just 2 minutes. With over 40 options across 8 dietary preferences every week, you can customize your meals to fit your lifestyle, whether it's Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, or Keto. Plus, Factor even offers wholesome smoothies, breakfasts, grab-and-go snacks to keep you fueled all day long. I love Factor takes the stress out of meal planning. I recently tried their Protein Plus meals, and they were packed with flavor that kept me full throughout the day. The convenience is unbeatable. No prep, no mess, just great food in minutes. If you're hustling from work to make your kids' games, that's where Factor can come in so big. Or you got an early morning trying to get a workout in. It's hard to find time to cook. That's where Factor comes in clutch. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/LockedOnCollege50 off and use the code LockedOnCollege50 off. That is one word with the numbers 50 used in there. And it's all one word once again. To get 50% off your first box plus free shipping, it's code LockedOnCollege50 at factormeals.com/LockedOnCollege50 to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Head over and check out Factor today. Shehan, to close out today's episode, you cover all of college football, and you do a really good job covering the Big 12 too. So I believe that Utah, they do not deserve right now, with all of the questions that you have and that I have too about this team. Right now, I don't think you can put Utah in the top 4. I believe this mix will come together, and this will be a team that the final week of the regular season is right there in the mix for the Big 12 title game. I think Utah is going to be a top 4 team by the time we get to November in this conference. How do you currently have Utah, and where do they stack up amongst other Big 12 teams for you?
It's a great question. And I would say, first, this league is wide open in 2025. There's some teams that I feel really good about, but I don't think that there's a dominant group, right? I think that I'd probably have Utah in sort of a tier 2 in the Big 12. It's kind of it blends a little bit, but
yeah.
I look at that top group. I think Arizona State's going to be back there. Kansas State, I think, has earned the right to be there most years. I'm really excited about what Baylor brings to the table. I think BYU is being a little undervalued right now. I know, but
they look good.
I think that once you get past that group, it takes kind of a weird one to try to identify with right now, right?
They were on your list as well. For a reason, with how much new things they have.
It's fascinating. I'm really interested to see there. But I think that, like you said, right at that the top of that tier 2 with a chance to move into tier 1, I think that's where I'd have Utah. Because what you look at with them really versus the rest of the conference, right? Because other teams in that group might be Kansas might be in that group, Iowa State, I think, still deserves to be in that group, but they had a big generation shift on defense. I think that what I like about Utah heading into this year is certainly you have the stability on defense, but I think that you have more playmaking on offense than some of the other teams in that group, and more consistent playmaking on offense. So I think that they're one of the teams that has more of a pathway to being a complete team. I look at a team TCU, I would also have in that group. But TCU again, do they have a running game, right? Like will they be able to be consistent on offense, and will they continue to be as good on defense when they lost some guys, right? So I think that Utah is kind of at the top of that tier 2 for me. But again, like, you just have to look to last season to see how much opportunity is there. And I think that there arguably is even more in 2025 than there was in 2024. I don't know that I see an Arizona State that's clearly just going to jump up, but I do think that, and sorry to make the comparison again, but like, I do think that there are some comparisons to 2024 BYU, where like you do see some real progress on defense, but like quarterback injuries were a hindrance for them. And, you know, you really needed to see growth there. BYU was able to do it through maintaining. I think that Utah obviously needed to add a little bit more on offense, but like, again, we saw when they had just a functioning offense, how good this team had a chance to be. It was just so little of the season that we actually got to see it. So, again, I think it's going to be how quickly can they play complementary football and be pretty good on offense. But there's every reason to believe that they're going to be, like you said, one of the 6 or 7 teams heading into the latter half of November that's going to be there in conference contention.
As much as it pains me to say this too, BYU is a perfect comparison. I mean, their win total was less than 4 last year. They shock everyone. They're really good in 1-score games. And honestly, by the time the dust settled, they were probably the second best team in the Big 12. Like, it was Arizona State, then BYU. And they had to go to the Sun Devils too. So that game could have been different had it been in Provo too. But that'll be interesting for Utah to see how they can bounce back. Shehan, you have so many things going on right now. So make sure you please tell everyone where they can follow you and find more of your great work at.
Yeah, you can read all my work at cbssports.com. I've got a big article on kind of Big 12 teams and what their biggest questions are in the spring coming out. I believe it's on Thursday. And then you can follow me on all social media platforms at Shehan Jeyarajah.
Shehan, thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That's going to do it for today's Locked On Utes. We'll be back tomorrow talking the latest in Utah football and Utah athletics.